Hello, I am Sardak, and just a quick bit about me. I work for Jesse at Best Practical. We make Request Tracker, which is, you might have seen on rt.cpan.org if you've ever reported a bug against the CPAN module. I live in America, specifically Boston, and it's pretty nice there. And I'm in Japan for about 2 more weeks, so if you want to hang out, come talk to me. Whatever, that's kind of weird. Like, you don't know me, so why would you? I don't know. I'm happy to talk to you, though. So, I'm just going to jump right into it. So, Path Dispatcher is a way to map strings to code references, basically, in a structured way. And mostly inspiration was from Jifty Dispatcher. And Jifty is a web framework that we write, that we wrote, continue to write. And we'll see later that the syntax is pretty much lifted directly, even though I've grown to dislike it a little bit. I'll talk about that later. So here's what it looks like. So if you've ever written a web application, you kind of you have code like this somewhere, most likely, to make your URLs nice and pretty. And this is what Jifty Dispatcher looks like. You can see that we use patterns, so that when you have a pattern in the URL, you can then pluck out that value later in the $1, $2 variables, just like you use regular expressions. And you can also use a type of rule called under to collect rules together, collect similar rules together, both to make it pretty, but also to make it a little bit faster, so you don't have to match the word ticket once instead of 3 times. It's a bit more readable, I think. So, next up is Profit and SD. So, Profit is a distributed property value database, so it stores keys and values. And SD is a bug tracker built on top of it. For a while, it had a pretty simplistic command line interface. But then Jesse asked me to make a much better one, and I hope I have. Maybe it's okay. Good. So I wanted to use something like this for my command line code. I think it looks pretty nice. The only problem is Jifty Dispatcher is written for a web application framework, so it's not quite portable to a command line application. It's also pretty strange to have to write slashes in your command line. You really don't want to do something like that. Who would want to type that? So instead we want something like this, right? Which is more natural for any kind of command line. Like if you ever have to use a command line tool that requires this, that's really unfortunate. You have to quote everything too, because the question mark makes it a file glub. So I wrote Path Dispatcher to handle this niche of write a command line dispatcher that looks like Jifty Dispatcher. So the basic API just looks like this. You have a rule, and inside you have code that runs when the rule matches. It's pretty much the same as Jifty Dispatchers. If it isn't broke, then why would you fix it? But I did say earlier that it's kind of broken, that I don't like it, so maybe I'm inconsistent. So the problem with Jifty Dispatcher, porting it directly, is that it still uses slashes for everything. And if we have the slashes in the pattern, then the user has to type the slashes, and that's kind of junky. So instead you can just pass a list, and we parse it based on whatever makes most sense for the interface you're using. So if you're using if you're using the dispatcher for a web interface, then you want slashes, but if it's a command line interface, you want spaces. So you only need one dispatcher, and both of those rules can match, depending on what you're doing. So I think that's kind of nice. You don't have to write your dispatcher twice, and it makes sense. So I love Moose, and Path Dispatcher uses it. Unfortunately, my boss doesn't love Moose, so I have to tolerate AnyMoose instead. And that's okay. AnyMoose lets me use Moose myself, so I'm happy. But for our users, they get Mouse, and that makes them happy too. So everybody's happy. So I use AnyMoose, and it makes the code a little bit uglier than I'd like, but that's okay. Mouse doesn't support quite everything Moose does, so I have to kind of shim a couple things, but that's okay. But either way, Moose object-oriented design definitely pervades Path Dispatcher's design. So the design kind of looks like this. We have a lot of classes, and that's just because I like object-oriented programming, I guess. And it makes it easy to switch out things, and it makes it easy to understand each individual piece, and then you can understand the whole much better. So one thing that's kind of nice is the rules have different behavior based on what kind of rule it is. So obviously, if you're matching a regular expression, that should have some kind of different behavior than if you're doing something more crazy like matching against a code reference. But this has made Path Dispatcher pretty flexible. It hasn't come up against a design problem I can't solve, which probably means I'm not using it in anger enough, but whatever. So this is Yuval Cogman, nothing much. He wrote KyokuDB. So I was talking to him about Path Dispatcher, and he suggested that I separate execution from dispatch. And he suggested this because it's a little bit cleaner, and it does improve flexibility, but at a small cost. So what does separating execution from dispatch actually mean? So it looks like that. So you have a dispatcher at the top. You run the dispatch, which matches the code, the string, and then you can inspect the match to see whether anything matched, and to inspect the matches at a deeper level. And then later, when you want to, you can just run the code that was associated with each rule that matched. So at the very end, we finally die because we ran the dispatch. So we can attach metadata to rules and inspect them, and it's pretty flexible. So that's why Yuval asked for it, and so far I haven't found a reason to think that's a bad idea. Actually, I have. I'll talk about that later. But I've since fixed that problem. So I told you that SD was built on top of Prophet, and that means there are two dispatchers because SD has a dispatcher and Prophet has a dispatcher for the command line interface. So we need one way to combine them into one dispatcher to make it really easy to for applications to reuse Prophet's dispatcher rules. So things like help come for free. So in order to have this is what the external API looks like, which is pretty simple. That's probably about as complicated as it needs to be. But that's the easy part. The tricky part is making this actually do something resembling correct behavior. So I was talking to my friend Yuval again, and he was staying with me in Boston, and he told me, and he suggested that the Path Dispatcher rule dispatch class, when it matches against a path, it can just return multiple match objects, which is something I hadn't considered before. So a single rule can return multiple matches, and that bit of design made it so it all worked out in the end. And when he was staying with me, at the time he was designing KyokuDB, and he had all sorts of really difficult questions, and I don't think I helped him at all. So I feel kind of bad that I took this good idea from him but didn't reciprocate. But he's off in his own world a bit. He's a bit smarter than everybody else, so it's hard to... whatever. So one nice thing about having this functionality is we can use it in many different ways, not just for extending a dispatcher. We can also use it to implement a plugin system so that, say you have a command line application framework, and there are plugins for that framework. Well, each plugin can add dispatcher rules so that they can add commands to the interface. And that's one way to do it. Similarly for URLs, if you're using Path Dispatcher with Plaque, you might have middleware return dispatcher rules. And then it all kind of plugs in together and works nicely. It's kind of a neat trick. So SD is a bug tracker, and we like being nice to our users and not requiring them to use the command line interface for everything, because it works great for programmers, but for regular people, a web interface is much more palatable.